Hi, everyone. I think we're up and running. My name is Stephanie, and I am an event host for Bank Square Books and Savoy Bookshop and Cafe. We are delighted that you are able to join us for this evening's virtual event. There are just a few things to go over before we begin. If you look at the bottom of your screen, you should see a chat button. We encourage you to use it during the event. Join in, say hello, and let us know where you're watching from. We just ask that you adhere to our virtual code of conduct, which has been posted in the chat. You can also ask questions using the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen, as well as vote for those that are most interesting. We will get to those audience questions at the end of the event. If you're joining us tonight from Facebook Live, thank you so much for tuning in as well. We'll do our best to filter your comments in, but to really join the conversation, come over to Zoom. Just to let everybody know, we might be covering some sensitive topics tonight, so if you need to step away or take a break, that's totally fine. This event will be recorded, so just know the recording will be available at a later date. You can always revisit it. If you'd like to purchase a copy of tonight's book, we're going to be posting the links in the chat throughout the event. This is going to take you directly to our website where you can complete your purchase. Books ordered tonight through the link from tonight's event will come with signed book plates. And we will get those shipped out and made available for pickup as soon as possible. All right, it looks like we're having some people join in. Don't be afraid to pop over to the chat. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Christy Tate to discuss Group with us, this amazing book. Christy Tate is a Chicago-based writer and essayist. She has been published in the New York Times, Washington Post, and Chicago Tribune.
Hi, how are you?
Hi. Hi, Christy.
Hello.
So Christy and I are going to talk together for about 25 to 30 minutes, and then we'll open it up to your questions. So, Christy, before we begin, I just have to mention that my background is actually in counseling. So I have a master's degree in counseling, and I was practicing prior to completely changing careers and becoming a bookseller. So this book hooked me instantly. It's fascinating. It was not at all what I was expecting it to be, but I have a feeling it's going to stick with me for a while. So why don't you give everybody a brief synopsis, just for anybody that hasn't read or that's just kind of new to group. Why don't you tell everybody what it's about?
Sure. The book opens and I am a young law student. I finished my first year of law school. I'm about to turn 27. I live in Chicago and I've done really well in law school and my professional future is gleaming before me. Everyone is patting me on the back and telling me I can go to work anywhere I want. And inside, I feel bereft. I don't have any relationships that are long lasting and fully attached. And I'm very, very lonely. Everyone I knew from law school had gone to study abroad, and I didn't go with them. And I knew that there was something about me that was broken. Those were the words I used, like broken or unhealed, or something was really wrong about the way I attached to people, and I didn't know what to do about it. And a friend of mine suggested that I check out her therapist. And first I was like, no way, I don't have the money. I had lots of reasons, but money's a good one. That shuts people up really quickly. And she said, oh, it's cheap, it's a group. And so you only pay $70 a week, which was still beyond my budget, but I was like, I could finagle that, I could imagine it. And I really focused on the part that it was cheap and didn't really picture those other people. But I ended up calling the therapist, and he, in the first session, Dr. Rosen is what I call him. That's not his real name. Nobody has their own
Googled
name.
him. I looked it up and he doesn't exist.
I would love to have some statistics about, I keep getting emails from people who are saying, I'm looking for Jonathan Rosen and I can't find him.
Yeah.
I'm like, that was by design.
Yeah.
And so he was intriguing, strange, and deeply, deeply confident. He seemed to have my number, and he was like, we can get you into relationships. You just have to join a group, and then you have to disclose everything you're hiding and everything about your relationships. You bring it to the group. And I was like, I loved the promise, but I was very wary about what I was going to bring to the table in front of these strangers.
Yeah. Yes. And so I just have to mention too, this book became an instant New York Times bestseller. Reese Witherspoon just recently announced that it was her book club pick for November. Those are huge, huge deals. So tell us a little bit about what that experience was like.
I mean, it's every writer's dream to be endorsed by these titans in our culture, these women who, like Reese Witherspoon, who are using their platform to put women's stories, not just women, but Reese happens to really champion debut writers. And it's absolutely like winning the lottery. And I feel still overwhelmed. I'm still pinching myself. My editor called me and told me about Reese's picking the book in July, and so I had to keep it a secret all that time, which was tricky. If you read the book, you know. I called Dr. Rosen and I told him, and I was like, "Is it okay if I don't tell the group? I can't tell the group yet." And he said, "Well, you're not going to keep the secret forever. It's a time limited thing." And I told my husband, and it's been a real thrill, and I still can't believe that this is happening.
Yeah. Well, congratulations, because it's great and it's well deserved. Would you mind reading a little bit from the book? You
Sure.
ready to do that?
By the way, the combination of counselor and bookseller is like a dream, like helix for me. Like those are two of my favorite people, the
Sweet.
booksellers and the counselors.
Oh.
This is like you're my people on both fronts.
Oh, that's so great.
So this is a scene. This is brief. It's right before I start group when I'm still negotiating with Dr. Rosen how and when and where. And this is the interaction we have right before. Before starting group, you've got 3 individual sessions. In my last one, my shoulders relaxed as I curled into Dr. Rosen's black leather armchair. I twirled my bracelet with my index finger and slipped my foot in and out of my shoe. I was used to Dr. Rosen. He was my strange old pal. Nothing to fear here. I told him that I knew him from meetings, and he said it wasn't a deal breaker. The only thing left to hammer out were the only thing left was to hammer out the particulars, like which group would he put me in. He offered a Tuesday morning co-ed group full of doctors and lawyers that met from 7:30 to 9, a professionals group. I hadn't been picturing men in my group, or doctors, or lawyers. Wait, what's going to happen to me when I start group? You're going to feel lonelier than you ever have in your life. Hold the phone, Harvard. I bolted straight up in my chair. I'm going to feel worse. I just met with the dean of students at law school to take out a private healthcare loan at 10% interest to pay for my new therapy. Now he was telling me that group would make me feel worse than the morning I drove around dribbling plum juice and praying for a bullet to my brain? Absolutely. He nodded like he was trying to knock something off the top of his head. If you're serious about getting into intimate relationships, becoming a real person, as you said, you need to feel every feeling you've been stifling since you were a kid. The loneliness, the anxiety, the anger, the terror. Could I go through with this? Did I want to? Curiosity about this man, his groups, and how they might score my heart inched out my resistance, but just barely. Can I call you to let you know? He shook his head. I need your commitment today. I gulped, stared at the door, and considered my options. The commitment scared me, but I was more afraid of walking out of his office empty-handed. No group, no other options, no hope. Fine, I commit. I grabbed my purse so I could slink back to work and fret over what I just committed to. One last question. What's going to happen to me when I start group? All of your secrets are going to come out. We can stop there.
Yes. So this is in my experience, this is a very unconventional group therapy, where confidentiality is basically thrown out the window. That's not, nobody has to sign disclosures within the group that anything that's said there has to stay. Basically, it's up to them. So as I was reading it, I was just curious to get your thoughts on whether or not you think is releasing shame as simple as telling other people your secrets?
That's a great question. And my experience is there is nothing simple about shame. My
Mm.
experience with shame is that it's sticky, it has tentacles, and the notion, if you would have told me if I was watching this conversation as the 26-year-old me before I'd gotten into group and somebody was just on a screen telling me, find a witness, tell them your shame, I would have thought, okay, also impossible. And so what I know is that for me, because I was so guarded and so locked down with so much shame about my body, my eating, my the way that I loved, the way that I was a friend, the way that I was a daughter, like everything about me felt suffused with shame. And
Mhm.
so there's nothing simple about telling anyone about it, which is why I personally needed to go to a group and have 6 people holding me and holding the experience and also modeling for me. I
Mhm.
tell my story in the book, but what a reader must also know is that alongside me there were other people who were doing their own deep work, and I don't go into that because that's their story, but they were modeling for me what does it look like and what's the payoff. And I did a little bit at a time. And that first day when Dr. Rosen said to me, why don't you tell the group what you ate yesterday, which I would have rather, probably almost rather, taken off my clothes because I was so ashamed of how I ate.
Yeah.
And spoiler alert, I was binging on red apples, which is not, it's not the stuff of a ABC after school special, but I had guarded that secret that had become like what made me monstrous to myself. And so when he first said, tell people, I don't know, there was nothing inside of me that felt like that would be an easy thing. And I threw a mini tantrum thinking, I can't. But also I knew this has to be the way forward. So
Mhm.
is it as simple as telling someone, yes, but that's also the hardest thing to do.
Yeah.
But I guess one thing I would say to people too is even if you don't sign up for group therapy, and a lot of people are like, I'm running so far away from group therapy after your book. I understand that. I respect that. But like, even if you could just work up the willingness to tell one person
Yeah.
something that you're carrying, I do believe that lightens the load and makes space for more health.
Yeah. Yeah, I totally agree. And I think what you say about shame is so important because shame is it's one of the most difficult emotions to feel and experience and then to also process because it typically is so private. But even though it's private and it's deeply felt and it does kind of permeate through our identity and our being and the way, who we are and the way we are. So I love I'm terrified of Dr. Rosen's approach.
Me
But
too.
it makes sense. It makes a lot of sense. And I think, I mean, the word vulnerability is tossed around a lot these days, but it takes a lot of strength and a lot of vulnerability to be able to do that. And I also really like what you say about the purpose of group therapy. It's obviously very different from individual therapy. And one of the main differences is that the group acts as kind of a mini world. Your relationships within the group and especially with the therapist are mirroring a lot of times your relationship in the real world. And there's a lot of really good work that can be done in that. So that's
That's certainly my experience.
yeah. Um, so one other thing I wanted to talk about, I really love how just completely honest you were with how you experienced group and group therapy and everything that you were going through very physically. We people often have very physical reactions to trauma, even years after the traumatic event, even years after they think that they've dealt with it. Um, so how did the permission to experience your emotions openly and physically and even viscerally in front of others play a part in your healing and health?
Yeah, that's a great question. That was one of the big shocks for me, that when I went to group and I started to thaw, right? Because now I had always stuffed my feelings, and Dr. Rosen caught on to that from the very first. I just must have ticked a bunch of boxes for him, like formal bulimic, total perfectionist, overachiever. Like, at what cost was I moving through the world to be first in my law school class and end up with no friends and no close relationships? And so when I started to thaw out and have anger in the moment in front of other people, for me, that was totally physical. And that happened without my consent to myself. Like, it
Yeah.
just, I didn't plan it. And I think that I had so violently kept it down that for it to come out, some of that really old anger and disappointment and terror, for that to come out, to heal from trauma is a very physical thing. And I think I knew, I mean, it's easy to make a very neat narrative now because I've lived through that. But
Mm.
when I think about being a young bulimic woman and girl, that's extremely violent. Bulimia is very, very violent. And the way I was doing it was violent. And when I think about like coming to and dealing with feelings in a more appropriate, life affirming way, how could it not be physical? How could it not involve my throat, my lungs, my belly, all the places I'd been clenching since certain experiences and traumas had happened to me? They happened to my body, and I couldn't fix them in my mind, and I couldn't thaw out only in my mind.
Yeah. I know there's a lot of research done. The book that comes to mind is The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk. And he does such a great job of connecting trauma to the brain, to the body. And for Dr. van der Kolk, like, he believes, and I think this is kind of becoming the more accepted practice now, that in order to heal from trauma, it has to be physically processed and physically felt in a lot of ways. That it tends to expedite the healing. So I love that is such a big part of group. Um, did you, I wonder if you ever found it difficult to kind of revisit or write about some of these experiences or past events, or if, since you had already kind of processed it in group, if it was more of a cathartic experience to revisit some of those.
That's a great question too. I think in some of the earlier drafts, I was more the transcribing the events, and I didn't bring my emotions fully to the page. And I think as a result, the writing was really flat. But it wasn't that bothersome to me to revisit these things.
Mm.
But when through the drafting process and revision and the feedback I got from my readers and my teachers was, you need to slow down and you need to tell us what happened with your body. And so when I started to be in my body while I was writing about, revisiting the scene of a trauma from high school, or the things that I had done with my body with sexual partners, like, that really, some of that shame came up. And I remember when I was writing the scene where it's not even super graphic, but I was writing about, as a little girl, I had pinworm, and I was like, I can't put that in a book. That's so gross. Nobody wants to read about anal parasites, But but I also knew that I was going to process something by doing it again on the page. And right that day that I had written it, I just was like, just do it. Just do it. You can always take it out, right? So I'd written about what it meant to me, and what a critical moment that was in group, because once I said it, it stopped. And then everyone in the group told a story about something they were embarrassed about that related to their private parts. And I felt that feeling of like, oh, we're all like, first of all, everybody has shame. Everybody has a butt. Well, not everybody had pinworms, but like, I just felt so much less alone. And I felt that was a feeling of like, we're all going to get well together. And I felt the healing power of that. And just today, somebody who's in the book, a former group member, she called me and she's actually, well, whatever. She's in the book and she's a group member. She called me today and she said, I wanted to tell you that I finished your book. Now, side note, I thought she read it a long time ago. So I was like, oh, thanks. And then I was like so scared of what she was going to tell me. And she said, I had been stalling because I didn't want, she was there through all of it. She's the one character who was there for all the groups, all the men, all the disasters and bad choices. She said, I just didn't want, it was so hard to watch you go through that at the time.
Yeah.
I didn't want to do it again. And it just brought tears to my eyes. Like, she was there. I was never alone when I was doing any of it. And there was something about the loving expression in that she just didn't want me to suffer again. And she was like, you were very explicit about the suffering. And so it's interesting that not only I have to relive this, but so do the group members who've chosen to read it and were there the first time.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point, because not only are you writing about it and reading about it, but you process this in front of other people, and other people in group often feel what you're feeling, and they're witnessing you go through something that is, sometimes it could feel embarrassing, or it feels very emotional, and they very much are invested in that as well. So I love that. So it sounds like you have switched from working as a lawyer, and now am I right? And you're working full time as a writer now?
No, I still work full time.
Okay.
I'm a lawyer.
Okay.
Yeah. So yeah, a lot of people are like, oh, you're just writing. I mean, I keep it pretty separate, but I do work.
Yeah. Okay. So tell me a little bit more about how you began writing. I know in one of the chapters, I think towards the end, you mentioned briefly kind of writing some of these essays on your computer at work while you were waiting for, is that kind of how it started?
Yeah, I think that for every job I've ever had since, since I first had a job where I could sit at a desk, I was always like writing things, and I didn't think writing was like an option for me. I don't know why. I think that was just a limitation in my imagination, one of the many. And I would just write like every job I've had, like on these big computer systems at like universities and law firms. I'm like, I'm writing a personal essay about being at Catholic school or having a bad boyfriend. And I would just like save them under a funky name and just hope no one comes across them. It's like, that's not very savvy. I don't recommend that. But anyway, so I'd always really enjoyed like self-expression and writing, and I'm a huge reader, and I always have been. And slowly I sort of walked towards writing, and just there was a group of us who were all young lawyers, mothers, and we were sort of deciding what to do with our lives. Like many lawyers, we were sort of like, this profession isn't really feeding my soul. So we all started books around the same time. And I wrote 2 novels, and I didn't know how to write a novel, and my novels reflect that. And I also didn't know how to revise. And so at some point, somebody just said, why don't you tell a true story? And I had read, like, like sometimes your life changes because of a series of events. It's like I had written these failed novels, and I knew they were terrible, and I didn't even like them enough to go back to them. And then I read Cheryl Strayed's Wild, and I could see her journey, and I was like, like I haven't ever climbed anything like a trail, but like I went back and forth to therapy 1,000 times.
That's a journey. Yeah.
I was like, oh, that's my journey. And then I was like, well, my life changed. So then I had the arc, and I somehow or other, I just started thinking, well, I'll write this story. I'll write this like practice memoir to like hone my chops, and then I can go back to novel writing. But it's like I stopped here for 5 years because it sort of became a real book.
Yeah. And I think I read somewhere that you, and this kind of connects to the, talking about how just the physical aspects of this book. It sounds like you took a writing class that really helped kind of bring that out, so that you were able to write more about the body and the physical emotions that you were experiencing.
Yeah, 100%. The work of Lydia Yuknovich,
Yeah.
she's a Portland-based national best-selling author, and I found her memoir, and she was actually in a writing group with Cheryl Strayed, and so like that's
Okay.
those are the lily pads I jumped to
Okay.
into my own work. But she wrote a memoir called Chronology of Water, and it blew me away on every. I had so many feelings like every page, and then I was going to write her a fan letter because I loved it so much and it just meant so much to me. And then I saw that she taught classes online that like anybody could take. And I just signed up for all of them. I guess take my money. I will do whatever you say. And she has a whole philosophy that's really sophisticated and brilliant about how the body has a point of view and the body has a story. And I showed her some early pages of my work, and she was like, you haven't said one word about your body through any of this. And I'm like writing about sexual assault. Like, how'd you do that? And she really encouraged me to think about where's my body in the scene, in every scene. And as I'm writing, and it really, that's when I believe my writing became something more than just a string of antidotes.
Yeah.
Anecdotes.
Yeah. Yeah. Before we go on, I just want to mention to the audience to go ahead and submit any questions you have through the Q&A button at the bottom. We'll be getting to those in just a few minutes, or you can submit them to the chat. I see that there've been a couple in the chat too. Okay, another question that I had was about one session in particular. I think it's in chapter 6. There's a silent session where there was 90 minutes of, it sounds like just complete silence. Nobody added anything. Nobody said anything. I'm curious if that, and I can't remember now, that wasn't, it just happened, didn't it? It wasn't like this is what we're doing today kind of thing.
No,
Yeah.
it was one of the most stunning 90 minutes of my life. And what happened for me personally is I'm very comfortable filling silence, like chatter, 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 talk at you. Silence makes me very uncomfortable. I assume if everyone's quiet, they're real mad. They're seething and stuff's about to go real sideways, real bad, real fast.
Yeah.
And so that experience was like being in my own mind in silence with other people. And I kept thinking, I kept wanting someone to say something like, Brad, say something about your money, like somebody talk about your divorce. Like I wanted that. And then it kept not happening. And it really, at first, like my mind was all twitchy and I'm picking off lint and listening to the train. And then at some point I kind of settled into it, not in any kind of monkish way, because I don't even know how, but I started in the moment realizing how sacred this is. Like, first of all, it's a total surprise. Like, how many times do you go somewhere where something so shocking happens? I love that about group. And that's what I hope that comes through in the book. Like, you're walking down the hall from the elevator and you're like, I need to talk about this and my boss and F that and blah, blah. And I'm mad at Dr. Rosen. But you open the door, and because the chemistry is all these people who also have their dynamic lives, you never know what is going to happen. And sometimes there's a brawl going on. And sometimes it's this holy, quiet, womb-like space. And it was just a trip, and nobody was drinking and nobody was eating and nobody had their phone. It was extraordinary. It was really extraordinary. I'm still processing that, and it was years ago.
Yeah, I think that's one of the first things that I remember learning as part of my master's program as a therapist was how to kind of hold the silence and how to be okay with that. For me, I didn't do a whole lot of work with groups, so it was mostly individual, but even in an individual setting, silence can be incredibly powerful, and to not feel like we constantly have to fill it or interrupt it, or add something to it is really difficult, but it can be really transformative. So how do you feel like, did you see a difference after that session with your group members? Did you see a difference in the sessions that followed and in your relationships with them?
What I think I remember is that there was something so tender about and vulnerable. There's something
Mhm.
really vulnerable about being quiet and making eye contact with people, and you're not talking and you're not filling, like you said. So I think on the back end of that, I remember feeling a sense of like tenderness for what the group could do and
Mm.
what it could hold and what it could tolerate. And I had seen it's like the band of experiences exploded because we had gone to heights and screamed and cried and fought and
Mm.
done trauma, and we had never done a sort of holy silence. And so I think following that, I felt this incredible trust that we had lots of tricks up our sleeves that we hadn't explored, and there was like this dynamism that could be very still and quiet, in addition to all the other shenanigans. So I think that there was like this trust and a peace that is like it could be a place where I could go and experience um, profound quiet with company, which
Yeah.
I can't think of another example of that.
Yeah. And I really like the words that you're using to describe that, like holy and sacred, because that is such a contrast to what it sounds like the rest of the sessions were like. And I really like how different and how unique that was. So, and I completely agree with everything you just said. Um, so I'm sure everybody is curious, just to hear a little bit about how everybody has responded to the publication of this book, including your group mates, your family. I think I read somewhere that I think you and I'm not going to give away any spoilers, but no, I'm going to skip that. Never mind, because that's going to give something away. How did your family, how did your group mates, how did Dr. Rosen respond to the publication of the book?
Well, the great thing about the group is because I've been in it and I've been talking, we've had years to process this book, what it
Mhm.
means, the prospect of it, how I treated things. Um, so from the very beginning, I was like, you guys, I think I'm writing a book about group. And everyone was curious, and would I exploit them? Would I properly and respectfully pay homage to what we do in the group, but also they didn't come to therapy to appear in my book, of course, right? So we've had to work on that for years, from the day one. And I sent them drafts, starting once I had one. I was like, here's what I'm up to. I feel like y'all should know about this.
Mhm.
And a couple of people read it. It's like, it's kind of onerous to read 300 pages of someone's draft, even if you are in it. And then once it sort of got more traction, um, what I've really, this is like a very archetypical example of what happens in group. Like you don't just have one conversation and then lickety split, we've settled
Mhm.
it. We're still talking about this book. We talked about it on Monday in our session. I'm going to go tomorrow. I suspect we will talk about it again. People, so the reaction, it's very fluid, right? For the most part, well, I'd sent the bottom line is people had seen drafts and I asked them if they want, I asked them to read it if they had concerns, and I would change anything that they thought if I'd crossed the line. And so I also asked Dr. Rosen, probably in December when we were still editing and there was plenty of time to make changes. I was like, can you read this, please, with an eye towards all of your other patients and be sure that you
Mm.
don't think I've crossed the line. Like look out for them, be their watchdog. Because anything that crosses a line, I'm taking out.
Yeah.
And so that made me feel like my ethic, like I had to be respectful and ethical. Like I have to face
Sure.
these people. I can't betray them.
Yeah.
And so that part has been, and then the reactions keep like just today, like I told you, someone from the group called me and said, I'm really proud of you. I think that was really painful to live through and you did a great job. It's a really good book. And I was like, well, did you feel at all betrayed or anything? And she was like, not at all. I didn't even recognize some of the people that you were like, you well, she goes, I forgot about that guy. I'm like, remember? So that's been like, it's been really wonderful to be held in that way. And this process is very dynamic. And I have to give credit to my family. They, like my parents, well, I'll talk about my husband. My husband's been awesome. Like I get these letters from people, their emails, and they're like, yeah, thank you for your brave book. Holy cow, your husband must be awesome. He is awesome. And he's just from the beginning, he knew me as a writer. And when I told him about this book, he's like, write a good book. Like he didn't care about, he's not ashamed or like feels like he has to protect me or himself. He's very solid as a person and wanted me just to write a good book. And that's been really amazing, because if there was any tension there around this, it would be so hard. It would just be so hard. And my kids are over it. They're like, let's move on. We're sick of hearing about mommy's book. And I would say my parents, I give them a lot of credit, because this is not how they would proceed in the world. They're from a different generation vis-a-vis therapy and telling the world you've had pinworm, like that's not how they would choose to interact or put a story out. And they've just been behind me, and they've just been really curious and respectful and just enthusiastic in a way that it can't be easy, like to watch your daughter, like they're probably very afraid for me. Like they're not from a generation where you talk about your sex life and publish it in a book with avid reader press. So they really trust me, and and a lot of the stuff they didn't know because I kept it hidden, and then I didn't know, like, so I go to this therapy, like it was harder to talk to them about it. So it's really opened up some new conversations.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, and I'm glad you just mentioned your husband and your kid. That's what I was trying not to say earlier. So I didn't. No, it's okay. As long as you're comfortable with mentioning that. But I was just going to say, one of the things that I really appreciate about this book is that the way that you end it. It doesn't just end with this, happy, like tied up with a bow, happy ending. It's, you continue with therapy. There's kind of an extra little bit at the end that, you talk about how this is an ongoing process with you. And I think that's one of the misconceptions about therapy, be it individual or group, that I think a lot of people have, is that it's, kind of this isolated event, like, oh, I processed this, I did it, now I'm over it and I've moved on. But I think that's the beautiful thing about therapy, is it doesn't have to be. You can pick it up again 2 years down the road if you need to. But I really love that it's an ongoing thing for you. It sounds like you even went this past week. So that's great.
Yeah, I really wanted to be clear that while in group, I learned about myself. I learned about how to have a relationship and sustain a relationship with myself and with others. But I'm still afraid to set a boundary. I'm still afraid to tell someone I'm angry. I'm not cured by any means. And I don't have an isolated life where I wish for death anymore. But I am a person who believes that what I get from therapy is something I still want with things that I'm facing today, because I haven't mastered anything.
Yeah. Counseling is great, y'all. It's good for everyone. I threw a y'all in there too.
I love
it. Let's go over to some audience questions. We've had a couple submitted through the chat. So let's see. Let me scroll back up here. So Tori says they're on the third part of the book, and a big part of it is about sex and intimacy. She would like to know, how did it help with bulimia?
Ooh, that is such a great question. I found that even when I was no longer binging and purging, that there were bulimic aspects to my my way of being. And that's maybe sound esoteric, but when it came to intimacy, I tended to have I could do these kind of relationships with men where, like, the first night we would talk, and we'd shut the house down, and not even necessarily getting physical, but I would tell them all about myself, and like, this thing happened in high school, and I have this tortured relationship over here, and maybe tell them about my eating disorder. And then I couldn't, that's like I just couldn't, that's like binging and purging on company and information.
Yeah.
And learning how to sort of regulate my emotions, I was able to do better pacing in relationships. Like I think of bulimia, like I'd eat perfectly during the day and then a switch would flip, right? And then I would eat one bite too many, or I would seek out a binge. And then I was like ravenous and getting rid of it. And there was like a whole pacing problem there. And I think that's how what I learned in group was this sort of regulation of like, on a first date, you go to dinner and you get to know someone and then you go home and then you don't have to like spend 7, 11 hours with, I go on like a 7 hour date and he would never call again. And I would be like, what happened? And there was something bulimic about that in my mind. So like the regulation of my emotions, as with my food, helped me do some pacing. I just didn't know how to do. I didn't have those skills at all.
Yeah. Good question. Ruth says, thank you so much for your honesty in this book. It has really changed my life, and I'm telling everyone in my life to read it. Let's see. She said, you joined a group and it seemed to have formed wonderful, lasting bonds with people in it. Do you think you can form that kind of intimate relationship with anybody, or do you still need to find your people?
That's a really good question. I think that I think of it like a muscle, and what I had to learn in group was like the give and take, talking about feelings, taking up space, giving space, listening, like really basic things I'd never. It sounds crazy to be 27 and not know those things, but I really had no practice in sustaining it. And so now I feel like because I've been doing group almost 20 years, y'all. So now I have watched myself take those skills out into the real world. And like I've met families, I concentrate on my female friendships. It's just worked out that way. But I have met families and women through my kids' school, and I love them, and I hold them close and I let them hold me close. And I'm seeing myself do the group thing in the outside world, which is that's what I always wanted. And of course, I do that with my husband as well. Like some of the things that we're able to negotiate, like a pandemic, our kids are at school at home, and and we both work full time, and I'm doing a book thing. So it's like it's so complex, but with these tools from group, I'm able to stay close and hold close because I'm not like trying to like keep it all tight, buttoned up, and nobody can see my mess. I mean,
Right.
mess is out there, and I can tolerate it, and so can other people.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's important to differentiate between, the way the group is handled in this book. You wouldn't just it's not, I don't think that you could just go up to, anybody that you've just met and just kind of spill all this out. I think that, group therapy, it's a time and a place, and everybody kind of has this, they share the same understanding of expectations and kind of agreed upon, I don't want to say rules, but just kind of guidelines for the way the group is handled. But
Yeah. The
yeah.
other thing, the thing that I get asked a lot is, could I imagine either myself or someone else healing in this way, but outside of group, right? And
Mm.
so I only know my story, and I'm pretty invested in group. So I'm like, I'm certainly all in on group. But what I know, especially since writing this book and hearing from people, I've heard from high school friends, for example, who they'll say they read the book and they're like, we didn't know that I didn't know that you were going through that, Christy. And
Yeah.
I had a similar thing. I had it manifested differently, but I arrived in my 20s with a set of things I had to work through. And I've heard people talk about like finding a one-on-one therapist or becoming really engaged in their profession in a very healthy way. Or somebody was like became a marathon runner, which is impressive. Could be like, well, I don't know about that, but had a ton of support and joined a running group. And it was really the fellowship. Another person joined a church that was outside of the religion of our youth. And so to me, what I hear is like people can find groups and healing healing people in lots of different venues. It just so happened this was mine, but I don't think it's the only way. I'll never know for myself if I could have found my way elsewhere, but I certainly have faith, and I love hearing about how other people put it together. And maybe it's only one person, like you meet a teacher, you have a mentor, you take up rock climbing, and there's a great friend there. Like if I could have strung any of that together, it would have really helped me. And I just started with group.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it certainly reminded me of my own group of friends. We have, I have a group of women who range in age from mid 50s to, late 20s. And we kind of span, careers and, everything. We're all very different. But at the same time, in our group, there's this understanding that basically any question is free game, and anybody feels it's taken, now granted, it's taken us years to get to that place where we all felt comfortable with that, but once you find those relationships, they can be incredibly helpful and impactful, and it feels very free to be able to share those experiences together. Okay, let's see here. We've had a couple of other questions come in. We just sort of just answered that. Okay, I'm going to go to the Q&A button. So Renee says, congratulations, Christy, inspiring work. Once you finished your editing, how did you decide which agents to query? And how did you have a book proposal ready to go? So this is more about the writing process. She says she's also curious about whether or how this publication has impacted your recovery process.
Ooh, those are great questions.
Lots of questions. If you need me to repeat any of that, just let me know.
All right. Well, you prompt me if I skip any parts. Thank you, Renee. So the first part, like getting an agent. What I will say to the writers out there is, I worked full time and had 2 children the day I started writing this book on November the 9th of 2015.
Oh, wow.
And I didn't work exclusively on this book, but that's the very first day, the first document it started that day. And then 5 years later, it lives in the world. And how I got my agent is I had published an essay. An essay of mine was published in the New York Times, Modern Love. And I thought that was the pinnacle of all. I was like, this is it. I'm retiring from writing. This is as good as it gets. And I tried to query I had tried to get an agent at that point. So I was like, hey, I'm in Modern Love. And nobody wanted my book. And so one of my friends, so I decided I was going to keep revising. So that was in late 2017. One of my friends said to me, when you're ready to query and find an agent, you should send your materials. I'll just say her name. She told me to send my materials to Amy Williams, who is my agent. And I wrote it on a piece of paper and I put a heart on it and I taped it on my desk. And we moved across town and I brought all my Post-it notes with me, and now they're taped because the Post-it part is no longer sticky. And when I had done all these revisions and I didn't know what else to do. And so I thought, well, I'll see if I can get an agent. And she was like one of the first people I sent to, and she ended up becoming my agent. And when I wrote her the note, like, please take my book, it was a completed manuscript, right? And I said, I've got this Post-it note on my desk. It's got your name on it. And I promised, I was just like, the way that I approached getting an agent was because I'd already been rejected in one round, like all the way down. I decided that I wasn't going to do this like I hate myself every time I get rejected. I don't want any part of self-hate around this. It's hard enough to write. It's hard enough to write about therapy. What I decided was that every letter I wrote to every agent was going to be an expression of gratitude, because I picked agents who brought books into the world that I loved, and I wanted to say thank you. So I fronted my gratitude and my praise for the work that they do, for stories that meant so much to me. And then it was like, I got to say something cool. I don't even know if these people read them. I don't know how it works, but I felt really solid in my gratitude. And I know if I'm going with gratitude, I'm going to end up somewhere good for my soul.
Yeah.
And so when she, I ended up signing with her, which was an amazing, wonderful thing. And it sort of feels, meant to be, because I've still got the post-it notes. I can see it right now, staring at it. So that's great. And the other question was, how does the publication of the book affect my recovery?
Mhm.
You know, here's what people may not know about when I was a young I was never a young writer because I started in my late 30s, but when I was early in my writing career, I would go hear authors speak, and I would authors I loved, and I would just be like, oh my God, how did they get there? I remember going to see Samantha Irby, a great essayist, raising my hand in the front row. They passed me the microphone, and I just was like, how did you get there? So like, I was so like fangirling, and it felt so impossible. It just felt so impossible. And I never dreamed I would be sitting in this seat talking to you, or that Reese Witherspoon sticker would be. And so what the experience, I once it was starting to happen, I didn't think I'd live a pain-free life just because Reese Witherspoon liked my book. But what I wasn't expecting was how intense the process would be and how much anxiety I would feel.
Mm.
Like, oh my God, am I doing a good job? Am I properly representing her brand and my
Mhm.
book and therapy and all my group mates and Dr. Rosen and my agent and all the people at the press? Like, you can tell I have a codependent problem because I'm like, I have to carry it all. But it has been so frightening
Yeah.
to end up here, and I don't really hear. I'm not sure. I feel like I'm not supposed to say this, but I'm going to tell you. There's a part of me that feels way more exposed. Like when I was writing, I thought, well, no one's ever going to read this, and then I got an agent like, okay, maybe 2,000 people will read this, and it's like
Yeah.
bigger than that. And
Yeah.
I'm thrilled and grateful. And right alongside that is a terror I wasn't expecting. And the reason why I bring that up is because if I didn't have my recovery program and some of the basics of this was before a group, the basics of that are like be of service, make a gratitude list. And I have really just stuck to that because this is such a ride. This is such a
Yeah.
crazy ride that if I didn't pray and meditate or do my journaling or talk to another addict or, call my group mates and see how they're doing. I don't know how I would survive this with any kind of like sense of myself. And so
Yeah.
it's really strengthened my recovery because I've had to cling to it
Mhm.
ever more so.
Yeah. Yeah, I can't even imagine. I mean, because I think that I guess like when you publish a book, there's always the possibility that a lot more people than you expect are going to read it. But I mean, my goodness, to be New York Times bestseller and Reese Witherspoon book club, I mean, it's incredible. But I can imagine that this is also a very personal book. I mean, you were thankfully so willing to share it and shared it so openly, but at the same time, I imagine that would cause some anxiety.
Yeah, I genuinely have no regrets, but I'm deep in my heart. I want everyone to like me and like the things I make, and that's unrealistic. This is not everybody's cup of tea. I am
Sure.
not everybody's cup of tea, and I recognize that. And people should debate work and they should talk about the merits of art for sure. But that's really scary.
It is.
That's been really that has required some extra tuning on my spiritual life.
Sure. All right. Let's see. I think we have enough time for maybe one more question and then we'll wrap it up. So Geneva is curious if you would have written this book if you had signed a non-disclosure. Um, so let's see. She goes on to say if you had to create composite characters a la Lori Gottlieb and maybe you should talk to someone, how would that have changed the book?
Well, as a lawyer, I would say if I signed a non-disclosure, that's done. And
Yeah.
if I was in a therapeutic situation with Dr. Rosen where the ethos was non-disclosure, I don't think that this project would have been born inside of me. Like so much of the work that we do is about um, not having to hold secrets. It's a totally different ethos. But if I signed a non-disclosure, that's an indicia of a totally different kind of atmosphere. And I would hope that if I bought into that kind of regime, that's not the right word, but if I had bought into that, I would have integrated those norms. And I think if I had created composite characters, I think that there's a way to do that. I think Lori Gottlieb, her book is amazing. And there's another therapy book called Good Morning Monster that was written by a therapist as well. Whew, it is super intense. Those aren't composite. Well, I think maybe they are composite, but there's absolutely ways to, there's lots of creative ways to work art and privacy and non-disclosure, all those different kind of considerations. But that's a great question. No one's asked.
But I think the fact that the group kind of, or even, before you started writing or, thought you might want to write about this experience, I like that this particular group kind of already had that out there, that there weren't non-disclosure agreements. Like that's very different. I had never, when I first read that, I was like, is this allowed? But I love how that develops over the course of the book. Okay, I said one more question, but we're actually going to fit two more in. Apparently a lot of people want to know about Dr. Rosen. So how are you handling readers' questions about his true identity or contact information from people that want to join his groups?
Yeah, it's tricky. This happened to me as well when I wrote in 2017, when I published an essay. The one in the New York Times was about playing Scrabble with him well after the events of the book, but like everybody was like, give me your therapist's number. And I didn't. And I feel very clear that it's my job to maintain the anonymity of Dr. Rosen. And we've talked about it, and I just said that's what I'm doing. And it just feels like that's not my role to proselytize for him. And the other thing is, if somebody is moved by my story and they want to find a Dr. Rosen or the Dr. Rosen, I believe that they will find their way and they will find their path. And I don't think it's kosher for it to be through me saying who he is. Because if he's disclosed, then all of his other patients, like, that's just like, it can't be me. It can't be me.
Right. And I think it's also important to say, and you mentioned this in your book too, that this wasn't the first therapist that you had ever seen. There had been a couple, and I think it's so important to get across to people that you can try out therapists, and you have to find the right one, and you have to find the one that works for you. And like you said, this type of group therapy isn't going to work for everyone. So I do think that it's important to say, you can, find what works for you and stick with that.
Yeah. Shop around.
Yes. It's important. All right. So what's next? What's next for Christy Tate? Are you working on another book or?
I'm trying so hard to concentrate right now, and there's so many obstacles, right? Pandemic, election, etc. So I'm really interested in what's happened. Like, this feels like the story of my relationships with men and how that got worked out. I feel like there's a story bubbling up in me about my relationships with women, and I've struggled all my life with being a very envious and jealous person, and how that's kept me far apart from women and friends. And I think I want to explore that, and that's something that's it's just it's an interest of mine. I think talking about jealousy is a hard thing, but it feels like that's the next frontier. Like, shame, for 20 years it was shame, and now I'm like, well, I think it's time for me to talk about jealousy nonstop.
Yeah. Well, that sounds great. I will definitely look forward to reading that. Well, I think we're out of time for tonight. So just before we go, I just want to remind everybody that the links have been posted in the chat for you to purchase the book. And if you purchase the book through those links, you can get a signed book plate. So we'll be sending those out and making those available to anybody who would like them. And Christy, thank you so much. I have so enjoyed this conversation with you. I love that this has just been the intersection of my two careers, books and counseling. And I've just really enjoyed our conversation. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Stephanie. This was like such a treat. And also to Bank Square, this is amazing. And to everybody who gave up their time tonight, thank you so much. I'm grateful for your presence and your participation. So thank you so much.
Thank you guys. Have a great evening. Bye.